This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. We are talking about how to show your character's feelings on the page tonight. And if you haven't already heard it, go back and listen to our episode on Evoking Emotion. There we focus on how to get your reader to feel along with your character, which of course raises the question, great, but how do I get my character to feel all these emotions as well? So that is the focus in this episode. And Robert, what's one of the big pitfalls or some of the big pitfalls with trying to show your character's emotions?
I think the first one that springs to mind is the one we keep going on and on about, and it's the whole, show, don't tell, or the reverse of that. The pitfall is the author telling. And probably my favourite description of this has been, probably heard around the traps before, but I will use it again. It's a little bit like the playwright jumping on stage just as the actor has delivered her line and saying, see how sad she was when she said that? And, as a writer, we can be that heavy-handed in saying, Philippa felt sad. And whilst the reader may be able to internalize that,
right.
It's heavy-handed in the sense that we're telling the reader how they should be feeling as they're reading. And it can jump you out of the story without really realizing that there's been an unconscious knock to the flow. And it's a little different to watching, Philippa's, brow start to crease and her eyes moisten and she reaches a finger up to wipe it away. And after a while, just can't help herself.
Right. Yeah.
So, the problem is, I think that you always feel like it can feel like you're waffling because it seems to take a long time, and it does. It takes more words. And so I think that's one of the challenges is, well, you're going to make it take more words. Now does my scene drag?
Right.
And the answer is done well? No, of course not.
Right. Yeah. No, of course not if it's done well. I think, we're raising a really great point about show, don't tell. It's also maybe an obvious point because, as you say, I think you called it the hackneyed phrase. It's an oldie but a goodie, but we need to go beyond physical manifestations of emotion to really get the emotions to come off the page and affect the readers. So there's the telling, Philippa felt sad, and then there's the showing, Philippa's brow creased and a tear rolled down her cheek. But we need to take it to the next stage because seeing somebody cry, we're probably going to go, oh, I wonder what's wrong. Why is she sad? But if we don't find out why she's sad and get engaged with the how, the why, and the wherefore, we aren't going to feel sad ourselves, or if we do, it's fleeting, and that's not the effect we're going for as writers. So, Catherine, do you have a thought either on how to or how not to get us to that next stage of getting emotion down?
I think we need to look at emotion as the larger emotion and not just like the in the moment emotion that the character is feeling. But I think we all live days or weeks or even, whole periods of our lives in certain emotional states. And I think that those deeper level emotions are the ones that are most important in showing your character going through. Not just the momentary anger or the momentary sadness, but this character is depressed sadness that is seeping through all of her actions, or, this character has anger issues. Something has triggered this rage that is just simmering underneath. And that's going to be the more potent emotion. And I think those are the ones that are a little different to try and get your character to show. I mean, you're not just showing the tear or showing this moment in time's physical manifestation of it, but their reaction to things and their interaction with other people and with their setting and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great point. That's something I've been working on currently, the current thing I'm writing, Jess has some PTSD from the end of book 2. And so how do you show that? Well, she's drinking too much, but what does she do? How does it manifest? It's not enough to say she's got this problem, so she's isolating herself and she's drinking and sleeping a lot. I mean, that's boring. So when we get into, I think, Robert, you mentioned relationships. What are those momentary flares of emotion like? And then how do they affect her and other people? How does it damage the relationships? I mean, part of the storytelling relies so much on layering things and providing context and subtext for things. So if Jess screams at her friend, there's the oh no horror of what she's doing, and then there's the worry about it ruining the relationship, and then there's the concern for will she get out of the PTSD and be able to mend things. So you can create these layers with, as you're saying, going to the emotion behind the emotion or the context that surrounds the flare-up of emotion, and to give us much more. Yeah, that's a great point.
Maybe, I like the fact that you could start with those two streams where you've got the overall emotional continuity, you might call it, where, who is the character, what's driving them, where's their life at the moment. And that presumably is going to be a part of most people's stories anyway, because it's, well, not necessarily, I guess, if it's an arcless story. But nonetheless, we're still got a personality type in there, whether it be James Bond or Jack Reacher. So you can derive much of it from that, and then under presenting that, how does that present is in the daily interactions or the moment by moment interactions, and that I think is what brings a character to life, is when their interactions become believable, because we know that's the type of person they are, because we know that they're suffering that that depression because of what happened previously or last year or whatever. And that to me that's gorgeous writing. When you read that as a reader, you just think, oh yeah, I can see why they, I wouldn't have responded like that, but I can really feel that that's what they would have done. It's most definitely.
I sometimes get frustrated when I'm reading a character story and their emotional arc over a situation or something that has happened is so short. They're sad for one scene. And I understand, because as a writer, it takes you a number of hours to write, the certain things, and you think, oh, that's done with. They can't still be sad. But like as a reader, as you're reading along, it's like 2 scenes later and all of a sudden they've completely forgotten that they were sad, or that emotional tale isn't long enough.
Right. Yeah, that's the continuity piece we were talking about in the last episode. When you were talking, Robert, you brought to mind the emotions drive behaviors. It's like, oh, yeah, because like so much of what we do is determined by our emotional set point. Like, does the depression fuel the drinking? Does the PTSD fuel the outburst? Or, does whatever your character's emotional state is, fear drives paranoia. So we need to find ways to manifest expressions of these states of being that then lead to the events or the situations that give us new peaks in emotion, new emotional flares over the course of the story. And that emotional set point can change, of course. I mean, by the end of the book, I want Jess to have resolved the PTSD, but for much of this book, this is what she's dealing with, and this is continuity from the last book, and it's got to be played out in her life, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think, there can be lots of different starting points with it as well. I find first drafts a very immersive process. I'm sure most do. And so that's probably where you're going to have the emotions most come to life. for you as a writer when you're writing, because you're vividly in the story. And that's a little harder to do when you're in the revising and editing process, because it's more of an analytical approach, perhaps. So I have found it useful sometimes when writing first drafts, because I know that my emotional elements of characters can be very dialogue driven, because let's face it, most of our emotional reactions and responses are going to be driven by interactions with others. Not all, but most of them. And that interaction could come from reading an email, but it's going to come from some interaction from another person. And exceptions aside, because, we might stub our toe, or the dog might do something that we hate, or, we witness something. But it's going to come mostly from interaction. So I use the dialogue to drive it, with my, hopefully, sense of character behind that. Knowing that I'm probably in first draft just going to throw in Indy was angry, and I might I write in Scrivener, so I might put a note in the notes there saying, make sure emotions driven through strongly here, because I know I'll forget it otherwise, and I'll want to try and get that sense of how I felt at the time. Maybe I was feeling Indy's anger, but I couldn't write it all because I needed to keep the scene moving. And sometimes that filling in the brushstroke stuff isn't going to help you when you're in first draft state. That's for me anyway, and it'll be different for different people. But so I think knowing where your strengths are at displaying emotions. And I mean, I found that I had great difficulty with beats and dialogue tags and general character tics. And so I did find, I know we've had Becca on the show before, I found the emotional thesaurus incredibly helpful as a newer writer back in the day, getting away from the shrugs, the eye rolls, and and moving towards something at least a little bit. And I still find some facial expressions unbelievably difficult to describe. Without resorting to the grimace or the, it's tricky, and you don't necessarily want to go overboard, because then you're leading the reader down a path they don't need to have. And so is there another way of displaying that emotion, displaying that character's emotion, so that the reader can experience it too? And often there is. It could be in dialogue, or it could be in the way they move across the room.
Yeah, it can also be in gesture. So keep in mind the power of subtlety. And so, after the fight, the character might sit in a chair and bury his face in his hands, and the sun sets and he doesn't bother to turn on a light. He just sits there in the dark. So that's a very still scene without any dialogue, with almost no action. You can write it very quickly using a sentence or two of narrative summary to show the passage of time, so it doesn't have to be, a drag. And it shows us clearly that he's feeling grief or remorse or depression or something, and it's through the mood of the room, the darkness, the hiding the face, so that's another way to go beyond trying to describe. It's still physicality, but not everything is clenched teeth and pinched brow and
exactly.
flaring nostrils. So, what you were saying about first draft versus revision is interesting, Robert. I'm finding right now that my first draft I'm focusing on the plot and figuring out the mechanics of the plot and the different threads and how I'm going to place the various points of view in relation to each other and such. So as I'm looking at it now, I'm making lots of notes like, this doesn't have enough emotional rise. Okay, this is too subdued. We need more here. Oh, you just had this reaction in a previous scene. I'm getting deja vu when I read this. Go figure out where you wrote the same reaction in cut one. And so, at least with this book, my second draft is going to involve a lot of adding emotion into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You said your character having the same reaction. And I think that we get stuck in,
yeah, we do.
The rut of a character having the same reaction over and over and over again. And I think it would be a very useful tool. I'm thinking about just going back and highlighting character reactions and like listing them out. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Because I imagine that you'd find a lot of patterns that you weren't aware that you fell into.
Yes. And then, they're going to jump out at many of your readers and you're just gonna be like, oh right. God, really? Did I do that?
Right. Because again, it can take hours or you have days in between writing scene 1 and scene 3, but your character acts exactly the same in both of them and your reader's going to read it in 15 minutes or 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
So
definitely.
And it's an all author trap as well. I mean, we all have our ticks and favorites. You only have to read a few Lee Child books, and if you Google Reacher said nothing, you'll probably find quite a surprise amount of feedback. There are people who have counted exactly how many times it's been used in a book, so it is very representative of his character. He's a big giant stoic kind of guy who is just going to sit there and wait for he's not going to be riled easily.
It's like the drinking game where people watch a TV show together, and then whenever the certain thing happens, whenever, Reacher said nothing, everyone has to drink.
Yep, exactly.
It's a little different with the book, but
this is why proofreaders, editors, even people at the line editing level can easily bring you feedback about repetitive loops. So you don't need to necessarily step back to a complete developmental stage to have even beta readers will bring that back and say, oh my God, how many times does he have to run his hands through his hair?
Right. Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Or like levels of reaction, like what kind of emotion that they have and where, and depending on the situation, because like we were talking about climaxing emotions and bringing them to a change at the end because your character arc has changed. Your character, like your reactions shouldn't just be different in terms of their physicality, but they should evolve along with your character because they've supposedly learned, right? And they're growing. And the things that cause them to have emotional reactions all need to matter to your story. So therefore they should evolve with your character.
Right, yeah. Are they thrown into a spin, or are they just gobsmacked, or are they just slightly taken aback? And that might depend on the dramatic element of the scene and how it relates to the plot.
Right. Yeah. We've talked about melodrama. I think it was in the other episode, but another hazard we should be sure to cover is holding back too much as writers. It's something I call nicey nice, when writers throttle their characters and their story, and it's sort of like we're writing what would be reasonable in real life, or how we would like to interact with people or be interacted with, but that doesn't always make for great fiction. In fact, it doesn't make for great fiction. I'll just say that. So, as writers, the best thing we can do is let go, full throttle, just unleash everything, be wild, be ludicrous, be over the top, because you can rein it in revision. But if you get surprising, exciting, compelling moments, reactions and emotions on the page, that's what's going to be memorable to your readers. That's going to be the exciting stuff. So especially in that first draft, you were saying it's immersive, Robert. Immerse, let go, be free.
And it's interesting, when you're saying about the nicey nice, definitely I've had that problem in the early days with, straight ping pong dialogue and everyday dialogue that isn't how we need to write. People don't need to say hello to each other much in books. They don't need to, but if there's a purpose behind it, that you can have two people sitting down having a cup of tea.
Right.
And one way to do it might be, he might say to her, you're angry, and she might say, you're dead right I am, and that could be okay, but it could just be nicey nice and ping pong. It might be better if he says you're angry and she just gives him a look, slams the teacup down and says you're a jerk and storms off. And that's much more visceral. So I think the trick is to get to that level of, I don't know if this is a phrase, level of viscerality.
And
that's what I mean about And that's what I find is a struggle in first draft, is that stuff's all going on in my head, and I've had my editor come back and say, this, you need more description here. What do you mean, you can't see that in there? It's there, but it's all in my head. And the same with the emotional responses as well. It's a real trick to get back into that state when you're editing and revising, and so, okay, I now need to bring that out. And for that reason, I will do different passes for sure.
Yeah.
You know, some passes will be around usually my big passes will be back around getting the scene structure right, and then I will come back and start to look at the rising, falling emotion, and you know, where is it bringing it to life? And now I'm going to make a note to myself now: levels of viscerality.
That's right. That's right. And you know, it's also important to remember, just following up on this, that everything doesn't have to be big to be powerful. So, you know, silence can be powerful. You can evoke deep emotion and show deep emotion through your characters without having a lot of action. So think also about pauses, about the space between the dialogue, about the mood you're setting on the page. And it can be humorous or loving as well as sad or explosive. You know, it's easier to describe kind of the negative end of the spectrum, but some of the best laughs come from the pauses. You know, when you're letting the reader fill in and get it, right? That 2 + 2, not 4 thing that we've talked about before.
Yes, that's another tricky one, isn't it? And we kind of touched on it in the emotional episode on showing evoking emotions in the reader, which is, if your character then is demonstrating and displaying the emotions and you've got it right as a writer, make sure that your prose also allows space for the reader to take the time to feel that for themselves. You know, some emotions can happen very quickly, obviously shock, you know, anger, instant grief, but some play out over time. And that's, as again, I think Catherine alluded to it, as a writer, you might be spending several hours on writing that scene, but for a reader, it's a few seconds or a minute. So having the skill to just deftly drip that back in to make sure that you're matching the reader's continued, what's the long tail of that emotion, perhaps? That's when you're reading a beautiful story. I think when it's things sit with you that are interwoven from the previous scene and it's still sitting with you and with the character and and relevant to the current scene. You know, that's real art.
I agree, and I like what you're saying, Robert, about the long tail, and shock is such a great example of that, because the moment the character experiences shock is going to be a brief moment. It might take time to write out the event that causes shock, so it might not be a brief scene, but the experience of shock is a brief moment in that character's life. But then there's that tail, because the character has to go away from that event and process the shock, and maybe the shock evolves into horror, and maybe the horror evolves into like a lingering dread, and maybe the you know, so there's that continuity piece again of how is this going to play out in my character's arc through this journey, through the events of the plot, and how will it drive the character's choices, the actions and reactions going forward.
Yes, as you were talking about that, I was reminded of that moment in Lord of the Rings where you know, Gandalf lets go of the bridge, the broken bridge, to fight the Balrog, and falls ostensibly to his death. And you know, the team, the Fellowship, can't believe it. You know, they've lost their wise leader who knew everything. And in the movie, I think it's really nicely done, because it is one of those. There's no words, there's no dialogue. They're all just wandering aimlessly. They're metaphorically showing the team scattered.
Right.
You know, we're no longer a group, and they're in they're on the side of a mountain. They're in a stark area. It's bleak. The music is bleak. Everything is letting that shock roll in waves. And as an audience, even though you probably know that's happening, most people who have gone to the movie know that scene's coming. It still sends shivers down your spine. So that's clever. And so you're right. I think things like shock. As a writer, you can think, wow, yeah, I really got my readers there, didn't I? That one. But what really gets them is when that sits into your body and doesn't go away. So
yeah, and that's when it's an art. Absolutely, yeah. Other thoughts? We have to sit with that one a little bit. We've got to let that sink in. Yeah.
Let it simmer.
I know. It's like,
That's we have Storyworks said nothing.
Yeah. Right. A hush fell over the round table.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, the more you talk about it, though, it is really hard, isn't it, to bring a character to life, and we've talked mostly about protagonists now. We want our antagonists to be as good at displaying emotions, if not better, and not the typical Machiavellian sort of moustache twirling stuff either. It's the more realistic the emotional drive of the antagonist or the antagonistic forces are, the more believable the plot is, the more intense the characters' conflicts are. It all falls into it. So no wonder few people end up finishing a novel or a novel that's any good anyway, or no wonder that you read your first draft and you think that's a pile of whatever, because it takes effort to bring those things to life. And you may have nailed your main character in first draft, but then you go back and read it, you think that villain is so pathetic that no one's going to believe it, and so you've got to go back and what's missing from that? We're not seeing any emotion from the villain,
right?
And look, some villains never present on the page anyway, so we're just away from the exceptions, but to the rule, if we are presenting a villain on the page, then they equally should be evoking emotions in the reader and showing them.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful saying you should evoke the same level of emotions from your villain as from your hero. The issue is point of view. Is this a point of view character?
Yeah.
So, if your antagonist has a point of view, then yes, absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.